Now it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Now, Kent and Phoebe Courtney, a husband and wife team, are publisher and editor, respectively, of the Independent American, a national conservative political action newspaper, which they founded in January 1955. The Independent American newspaper has subscribers in all 50 states. Other activities of Kent and Phoebe Courtney include the publishing of the tax facts pamphlets advocating the conservative position on such national issues as foreign aid to education, socialized medicine, federal urban renewal, and so forth. More than 3 million copies of these tax facts pamphlets have been published and distributed during the past 5 years. The Courtney's first book, The Case of General Edwin A. Walker, How the Appeasers Proposed to Substitute Surrender for Victory, was published in August 1961. The second book by Kent and Phoebe Courtney, The CSA Voting Index, which contained a tabulation and analysis of the key votes in the 1961 session of Congress, was published in early 1962. Kent Courtney is the commentator of the radio edition of the Independent American, a weekly broadcast of conservative side of the news, which is heard over an ever-increasing number of stations from coast to coast. In July of 1961, Mr. Courtney published an expose of the Council on Foreign Relations entitled America's Unelected Rulers. Now, this book documents that the Council on Foreign Relations is carrying out plans designed to destroy America's national sovereignty, subvert the United States Constitution through NATO and the Atlantic Community, and put the United States under the control of a socialistic-dominated world government. Courtney, born in Minnesota, moved to New Orleans in 1929. He is a graduate of the School of Business Administration of Tulane University in New Orleans, isn't it? Having majored in economics and later serving as an instructor in economics in Tulane's University College, his wife, Phoebe Courtney, attended Newcomb College in New Orleans, and both Kent and Phoebe Courtney are members of the anti-communist John Birch Society, founded by Robert Welch. Now, Kent Courtney is also the national chairman of the Conservative Society of America, a political action organization whose major purpose is to elect anti-communist conservatives to the Congress. The publications of the Conservative Society of America prove that there is no real difference between the Democrat and Republican parties, and the Conservative Society of America is therefore dedicated to establishing a new party in the United States which can gain the support of all conservative Americans. The publications of the Conservative Society and the Independent American can be examined and purchased in the Georgian Room. Now, our next speaker will take us forward to 1966, and he will be speaking as the presidential press secretary at that time. And so I am going to ask all of the audience to make believe that this is now the year of 1966. And therefore, it gives me great pleasure to present the Peter Salamander of 1966, the press secretary, to the president, Mr. Kent Courtney. Mr. Kent Courtney.
Thank you, Colonel Purney. I am honored to bring you greetings from the President of the United States, who would very much have liked to have met today with all these great patriots here in the city of Boston. But as you have read by the morning papers, our great conservative president, who has been in office only 2 years, is today participating in a very important ceremony by attending the inauguration of the first president of the new Free Republic of the Ukraine. As all of you will recall, one of the first official acts of our conservative president, who was elected in 1964, was to break off relations with the Soviet Union and all the nations of the Iron Curtain subject to the domination of the international communist conspiracy. You'll recall how the leader of our conservative party was able to win the election in 1964 on 2 basic planks: freedom for the American people and freedom for a better world. Our president announced early in the campaign that if elected, he would adopt a policy of liberation without war. In developing this theme, he was able to prove to the American voters that the adoption of a firm anti-communist domestic and foreign policy would be in the best interests of all the American people, our neighbors in Central and South America, and for all those people and nations seeking true self-determination and liberation from the communist tyranny. But before we go into the success of the foreign policy during the first 24 months of this conservative administration, let us go back and review the policies adopted at our nominating convention in 1964, just 2 years ago. We adopted a positive policy of freedom from foreign tyranny, freedom from federal usurpation and encroachment, freedom from violation by any state of constitutional guarantees, freedom from crushing confiscatory taxation, freedom from coercive intervention into the private affairs by parasitic and predatory bureaucracy, freedom from unfair and ruinous business competition by tax-financed bureaucracy, freedom from conspiracy and restraint of trade by business and labor union monopolists, and freedom from conspiracy and restraint of choice by inter-party political monopolists. Now, to implement the policies of freedom for the individual and our foreign policy of liberation without war, the Conservative Party at its national convention just 2 years ago adopted a program of action designed to appeal to the majority of all Americans. We felt by adopting these policies and our program of action that we would be able to get votes from the minority blocs as well as the great majority of those Americans who do not feel that they belong to any class or segment of society. Through these appeals to common sense and the American tradition of fair play and responsibility for all, we were indeed successful in breaking up the so-called bloc votes in the big cities. But before we go into the details of how we won the election in '64, let me recall for you our winning program of action. We resolved in convention assembled to reappraise the political and military doctrines which since 1945 had reduced the United States from a position of incomparable power to a condition of dire peril. We proposed to break relations with all governments which were openly creatures of the international communist conspiracy. We promised to withdraw from any and all projects which would lead to the establishment of a one-world socialist government. The United Nations had failed to keep the peace and was merely being used by the Soviet Union as a smokescreen for international aggression. We promised that the United States would get out of the United Nations and that the United Nations would be removed from American soil. We resolved that we would maintain our own nuclear deterrent and would use it for the preservation of world peace, to keep the international communist conspiracy in check, so that our policy of liberation without war would be effective and meaningful. One of the most popular issues was our definite promise to liberate Cuba immediately. We committed ourselves to the unilateral enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine, which was applauded by the nation and received the approval of the governments of Central and South America and all men everywhere who were interested in freedom. At this point, I wish to depart from our convention platform to show how we carried out one of these planks, namely the liberation of Cuba. First, we put a ring of steel around and above the island of Cuba. No ships, no planes were allowed in or out of Cuba. We announced to the world that this was being done in our own self-interest, for the preservation of our own national sovereignty and independence. The free world understood and applauded our firmness of action. We ignored the howls of the Soviet-dominated so-called press opinion. We recognized a government in exile. We trained and supplied Cuban freedom fighters. The masses of the Cuban people heard by radio and saw on television that at last the United States meant business about removing the cancer of communism from the Caribbean. Very quickly, large armies of freedom fighters were recruited from the oppressed Cuban people. A few Russian MiG fighter planes tried to rise off the island of Cuba, but were immediately shot down by our Navy and Marine Air Forces. Thus, the Russians and Chinese on the island were convinced we meant business. Within a few weeks, the Cuban freedom fighters were turning over hundreds and thousands of Russians to our base at Guantanamo. We took 100 Russian officers and technicians to London, another 100 to Paris, and another 100 to Rome, and there exchanged these Russian prisoners for Americans still held prisoner by the Soviet Union. Several thousand Red Chinese on the island of Cuba were also turned over to us. We exchanged these in Tokyo, Hong Kong, and Korea for American prisoners of war that had been rotting in filthy Chinese jails since the shameful Truce of Korea. With these moves, we began to carry the physical and psychological offensive against the Russian conspirators. The pattern of action followed in the liberation of Cuba was also followed in the liberation of other countries behind the Iron Curtain. Now, back to our winning platform of 1964. We promised to end programs of foreign aid to all nations which refused to support the United States in the struggle against communism. We also stopped the foreign aid giveaway program to all other nations, where such aid really amounted to the subsidy of socialist governments and the subsidy of industries in those countries producing products which competed with American labor and management. One of our strongest domestic planks was our promise to carry out the resolutions of the American Farm Bureau, which meant the end of programs of intervention in agriculture, which through subsidies and controls had made the American farmer either a ward or a slave of the federal government. We promised to return our immigration regulations to the original legislative concept of preserving the American cultural heritage of freedom. We promised as another major plank of our domestic platform to eliminate unconstitutional and uneconomic business and industrial operations of the federal government in order that all the people would receive the maximum benefits of the free enterprise economy. This plank was closely allied to our promise to expedite the repeal of the 16th Income Tax Amendment. We also promised to enforce the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution by eliminating all those activities of the federal government not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. The members of the bureaucracy found themselves looking for jobs at the state level. We found it was cheaper to have them on unemployment compensation than inside the government wasting our money. We promised to renovate the program of internal security in order to free the government from infiltration by subversive agents. And finally, we promised to restore the dignity of the Supreme Court of the United States by constitutional means. Now, we had a problem in convincing the American people that a new political party could be successful. We had to go back in history to the birth of the Republican Party, which at that time was a new political party. Its main issue when it won the election was the fact that it promised freedom for 10% of the people, and it rose on this burning issue to success and to power, because the people at that time could find no difference between the Whigs and the Democrats. So it became necessary for us to point out that there was no difference between the Democrat and Republican parties, and we had to answer the false charges, the false claims of that publication put out by the Republicans in Washington known as the Battle Line, in which they said we are the party of fiscal responsibility. I'll never forget on that nationwide broadcast when our conservative candidate for president, you see, we were on the ballot in all 50 states, so we could demand equal time. And we had to expose the Ike administrations, the Republican 8 years, as something of fiscal insanity. And here it is. Eisenhower spent over $50 billion more in 8 years than Truman and Franklin Roosevelt spent in 20 years, and that included both world wars. Both the World War II and Korea. Second, the largest peacetime deficit which occurred since 1933 took place under Eisenhower in 1958, and this deficit was $12.4 billion. This deficit was larger than the total combined deficit of both the Hoover and the Roosevelt administrations. The national debt under Eisenhower increased from $259 billion to $286 billion, an increase of $27 billion, which was more than the increase in debt between 1900 and 1934. Incidentally, under Truman, the debt only rose $1 billion in 7 years. In 1952, the interest on the national debt was $5.86 billion. After 8 years of modern republicanism, the interest on the debt cost the American taxpayers $9.2 billion, which was greater than all the money Roosevelt spent between 1936 and 1940. On page 381 of the Statistical Abstract for 1962, we find that the spending by the Executive Office of the President increased from $9 billion in 1955 to $69 billion in 1960. Between 1954 and 1960, Eisenhower gave away $29 billion of your tax money in foreign aid. This included aid to the governments of communist countries, including Czechoslovakia, communist-controlled East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Yugoslavia. You see, they're taking pictures of how small the audience is. They waited till everybody went to lunch. The United States went broke in 1960. By this we mean foreigners had claims against our gold stock in excess of the gold stock on hand. In 1955, we had $21.8 billion worth of gold. The claims of foreign nations against this gold was $13.6 billion, leaving only $7.2 billion to back up our paper money and our credit money. But under the modern Republican administration of Eisenhower, the gold stock had been reduced to $17.8 billion, whereas foreign countries, the recipients of our foreign aid, had claims against this gold stock of $21.3 billion. The Republicans claimed in 60 and in 62, and they claim now in 66, that theirs is the party of fiscal responsibility. Yet by 1960, we had lost control over all of our gold, and if all the foreign countries should make a claim at once, we'd end up owing to foreign nations $3.5 billion worth of gold we don't have. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, what we are suffering from, what we were suffering from in 1960 and 62 was socialism, the support of international socialism abroad, and the extension of the welfare state at home. When these facts were presented to the American people during the presidential campaign of 1964, it served to wake the people up to the fact that in the areas of fiscal irresponsibility, there was no difference between the Democrat and Republican parties. The man who ran for president on the Socialist Party ticket in 6 different presidential elections summed up the situation when he said, "The United States made more progress towards socialism under the Eisenhower administration than under either of the 2 previous administrations." And that's a quotation from Norman Thomas. And as a practicing socialist, he should know socialism when he sees it. If you wish to check these statistics and the figures that I've just recounted to you, I refer you to the Statistical Abstract of the United States, 1962, page 680. And of course, in the campaign, we had to prove that there was no difference between the 2 parties on both domestic and foreign issues, other than in the field of fiscal irresponsibility. So on the campaign trail in 1964, a great deal of attention was paid to the domestic issues. And here again, it was necessary to inform the voting public that there was little, if any, difference in the field of the promotion of domestic socialism, the expansion of the bureaucracy, and the proliferation of unnecessary, wasteful spending. During the Eisenhower administration, Council on Foreign Relations member Nelson Rockefeller engineered the establishment of a new socialist empire called the Health, Education, and Welfare Department. He did this while assistant to President Eisenhower as $1 a year man. What an expensive dollar that was. And it was Kennedy who proposed the establishment of an urban affairs department in order to take control of the political patronage available in the cities. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy increased the civilian spending and the civilian payrolls of our bloated bureaucracy. Eisenhower and Kennedy both pushed with all the vigor at their command for federal aid and control of education at all levels. Eisenhower unconstitutionally sent troops into Little Rock, interfering with the local control of education, and Kennedy sent more than 25,000 Army troops to Oxford, Mississippi, in a breathtaking show of force against a sovereign state. Many Southern Democrats figured that this was some form of retribution because in the 1960 election, Mississippi had withheld its electoral vote from Kennedy. Incidentally, more troops were used at Oxford than Grant had available at Vicksburg. George Washington had fewer troops available to him throughout the entire Revolutionary War. Both Eisenhower and Kennedy increased the national debt and depleted the gold reserves to the point where foreigners had more claims against our gold than we had gold to redeem them. The Democrats under Truman tried to assassinate the character of General Douglas MacArthur. Under the soft-on-communism administration of Eisenhower, character assassination was again attempted against that great senator from Wisconsin, Joseph R. McCarthy. And Kennedy removed a fighting general from command because this general merely wanted to teach his troops the dangers of the communist conspiracy. And we're certainly proud to have a member of our conservative team, General of the Armies, Edwin A. Walker. During the Eisenhower administration, Communist Frontier, no, that's supposed to be Communist Fronter. Say, I've located the new frontier. It's right on the border between communism and socialism. During the Eisenhower administration, Communist fronter Philip Jessup was appointed to be the U.S. representative on the World Court, while Kennedy appointed an architect of the Cuban disaster, Roy Rubottom, to be a political commissar to the Naval Academy. Many other similarities between the Republican and Democrat parties were featured during the 1964 presidential campaign by our candidates for Congress. The success of the Conservative Party was due in large part to our emphasis on the fact that both old political parties were merely smudged carbon copies of one another. And we had to go on into foreign policy because this was the the most important part of our fight for Americans who loved their country and wanted freedom and independence, for them to convince the masses of the American people that the conservatives did have the answer. Referring again to the presidential campaign of '64, the American people were enlightened by the speeches of our president and vice presidential candidates. The two top members of our ticket were so evenly matched that both could talk equally well about the failures of policy and performance which had occurred under both parties in both foreign and domestic policy. At times, our presidential candidate would concentrate on the domestic issues and again on the international issues. In order to get the American people to accept the fact that there was a need for a new conservative party, it was necessary during the 1964 campaign for our candidates to prove that there was no difference between the platforms and policies. The Democrats had to run on their record of softness towards communism, but the Republican candidate found that he too was on the defensive because the conservatives pointed to the record of the Eisenhower administration, and that was the only record the Republicans had, which showed that softness towards communism was not limited to the Democrat Party alone. Our spokesman pointed out that Eisenhower met with the hangman of the Ukraine in Geneva, while Kennedy apparently went to Vienna to get his orders. Eisenhower proposed an open sky policy allowing a mutual inspection of each other's territories. This took place at Geneva in '56. In 1961, Kennedy proposed at the United Nations the three-stage disarmament plan, which would turn over the Army, Navy, and Air Force to the United Nations. In 1962, the Russians were flying over the United States in spy planes based on Cuba. Eisenhower initiated foreign aid to communist countries, including Poland and Yugoslavia, and Kennedy continued this policy. Ike signed a contract with Tito, Moscow's Trojan horse in the Balkans, for the supplying of jet planes to Tito's Air Force and the training of Yugoslav pilots in the United States. Kennedy continued the same policy. Eisenhower initiated the fraudulent and dangerous so-called cultural exchange program with the Communist Empire, while Kennedy, with a stroke of his pen, opened up the unlimited use of the mails to communist propagandists, with the postage burden being paid for by United States taxpayers. Under the brinkmanship of the Council on Foreign Relations member John Foster Dulles, the pro-communists in the State Department betrayed Cuba to the communists by cutting off arms to Batista, while allowing aid to go to Castro in unlimited quantities. Kennedy again betrayed the Cuban people when he rounded up the Cuban freedom fighters in the United States, gave them inadequate training in a base in Guatemala, delivered them to a bay named for pigs, and at the last moment called off all of the United States invasion forces which were supposed to support the Cuban invasion in April of 1961. This action on the part of the Kennedy administration was deemed by many to be treason against liberty itself. I'm reading the speech because I don't want to be misquoted when I talk about treason. Treason is the only crime defined in the Constitution, and it says that treason is giving aid or comfort to the enemy. We're talking now about the records of two parties, and both have been guilty of giving aid and comfort to our enemies since 1933. The modern Republican pro-communist administration of Eisenhower ignored the butchery in Hungary and Tibet and made only half-hearted efforts to bring about a wrist-slapping censorship in the ineffective United Nations. Kennedy ignored the widespread butchery of Cuban businessmen, which took place in Cuba, and later cynically used the Cuban situation as a means to prevent the loss of congressional seats for the Democrat Party in '62. Having explained the issues to the people, we then went into the elections. And I'm going to give you the state-by-state results of how the conservatives won and why they won in the various states, and then I'm going to give you a report from the members of the conservative cabinet, that is, the conservative cabinet that's in power today in 1966. I'm acting, for those latecomers, I'm acting as the press secretary of the conservative president in giving you a report of the first 24 months of the success of our conservative candidate for president who went into the White House in '64. Now, you see, we approached a very interesting situation because we had the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans had nominated Rockefeller and Senator Kuchel, that great liberal Republican senator from California. And that was their ticket. And the ticket on the other side was Kennedy and Senator McCarthy of Minnesota. They had to get rid of Lyndon Johnson because he had that southern approach. So here then was Kennedy, who was trying to get certain the block votes of the big cities, because they figured if they get the block votes of the big cities, they'd carry the big city states, and this would give them the electoral votes. But this new situation had occurred. The conservatives had organized themselves in '63 and in '64 and achieved a ballot position, so they were able to go to an outstanding conservative candidate for potential candidate for president and said, look, Mr. I'll leave that name blank. We're now on the ballot in 50 states. And our potential candidate said, well, this is a lot different than in 48 or 56, when the conservatives could only get on a few state ballots. Because we had the remarkable opportunity that two liberal, left-wing international labor socialists were trying to get the same bloc votes in the big cities, and they split them, while our conservative candidate was appealing to the great masses of the American people on basic issues of freedom. We were able to win, and I'll show you how. First, I'll tell you the states we lost. We lost, the Democrats gained California because of the efforts of AFL-CIO Cope. They got Connecticut, no one knows why. Delaware went, and that was 3 more votes. Harry Bridges delivered Hawaii. Maryland was gone, we weren't well organized in Maryland. Kennedy bribed his way through Massachusetts. He carried Minnesota, the Farmer Labor Party carried it for them. He stole New Jersey and the welfare state of West Virginia. So they got 113 electoral votes. Now Rockefeller, he took Alaska, a welfare state. Thruston Morton delivered Kentucky. Maine was taken in. Nebraska voted Republican by habit. Ohio was delivered by Ray Bliss. He was still a loyal Republican first. Oregon went because Hatfield was promised something. Scranton had been promised a Secretary of State, and he delivered Pennsylvania. Rhode Island went, Utah, Vermont, and the state of Washington. And although the split did occur in New York City, Kennedy and Rockefeller split it up. They also got New York, and Republicans got 144 votes. Now I'm going to analyze the vote of how we won the election by section. Now, the basic issues that appealed to the most of the people were our repeal the income tax platform, lowering taxes. This was more freedom for everybody. We were able to get around AFL Cope in many states because they couldn't promise a 20% increase in take-home pay. We promised, well, then you can't compete with belly issues like that. Foreign aid was a tremendous help to us everywhere. And getting out of the United Nations after the massacre that took place in the Congo. And when the people realized that the big reason why the communists who had control of the Adula government wanted to take over Katanga was that Katanga supplied 85% of the free world supply, not of copper, cobalt. Cobalt, the very necessary ingredient for the hardening of all of our industrial steel. Cobalt, the ingredient of the dirty bomb, the one with the maximum fallout. This is the ultimate terror weapon that the communists wanted. Therefore, we had to take Cuba, and take Cuba immediately, because just before Castro came to power in Cuba, the United States had developed alternative supplies of cobalt in the laterite deposits in Cuba. Wasn't it interesting that Castro was able to take over Cuba just as we were about to develop a supply of cobalt in Cuba, which combined with our own domestic supply would make us just about free of the cobalt from Katanga. So you see, the patterns of Soviet conquest had a real meaning back in the 60s. They wanted the cobalt. They wanted to deprive us of the cobalt. Well, with those as the basic issues that were shocking the American people, plus the fact that there was a tremendous scandal in the foreign aid program where it was found that George Ball and a man by the name of Hamilton Fowler, who had been in foreign aid, had got themselves involved, and because they want to make some money, in a Swedish corporation that was going to go in and get the control of this copper and cobalt. But George Ball and Fowler Hamilton and others weren't able to get it because the communists came in and took it over. So with these as the overriding issues in 1964, we were able to take the southern states, assuming an oversimplification of why we were able to take them. We took Arkansas and Mississippi because of troops, the enemy's troops. Florida came with us because we promised freedom for Cuba. The South generally because we had a sensible program of individual rights guaranteed under the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. North and South Carolina and Virginia came along basically because they're being hurt on the OECD treaty. They're being hurt terribly because under Kennedy's so-called treaty for, what was that called back then? It was not alliance, no, that failed. It was called a trade expansion. Trade Expansion Act. But it turned out it was a Trade Control Act because Kennedy, through being able to control the import duty of all products, was able to have an absolute life and death control over every single business in the United States that was affected by foreign competition, which was almost all of them. And so these businesses started to go out of business, and they got on the federal dole, and the retraining and redevelopment programs began to develop, and the people found themselves in chains, and depression started to hit in the latter part of '63. Tennessee revolted against TVA. There wasn't enough power. Most of the counties of Tennessee were declared underdeveloped and disaster areas. Texas came along with us because in the 1963 program, Kennedy lost all of his oil support because he eliminated the depletion allowance. And so we were able to get 128 electoral votes from the South. Now in the West, we were able to capture most of the western states because we promised to return to the gold standard. And we restored mining in America to its former important place in our economy. They were also interested in our position on oil and on freedom for the farmer. And we had a mixed reaction in the Midwest. We were able to capture Illinois because, whereas we had failed in New York, we were able to capture Illinois because Kennedy and Rockefeller did split Chicago, but we carried the rest of the state. Jenner in Indiana came back into the political scene, and he delivered Indiana. The farmers in Kansas were fed up, and they joined us, and this was true of Missouri and North Dakota, South Dakota. The big thing that helped us carry in Wisconsin was not only competition from foreign sources for the manufacturing industries, but we promised liberation. We split the Milwaukee vote. We got the entire Polish vote in Milwaukee, and thereby we carried the state. We got half of Milwaukee and all of the farm area in Milwaukee, in Wisconsin. So that gave us, including Iowa, that gave us 115. So we also won New Hampshire. The only thing because the turmoil and everything was so confused. Republicans didn't know Democrats. Newspaper editors fought with former governors. It was an amazing thing. And New Hampshire, we got 4 there. So we won the election with 276 votes, which was just 11 more than we needed. Now that we've reviewed the details, the political details of how we won, we have to thank, of course, all of those people that helped make it possible. But now, as the press secretary of 1966, press secretary to your president, I am going to give you a report from members of our cabinet and high officials in our government. And first, these reports are condensations of some rather long reports, and from our Postmaster General, by the application of business principles, he's reduced first-class postage from 10 cents per letter, which was the rate at the end of the Kennedy administration. We can now mail our letters anywhere in the United States for 3 cents, and most first-class mail goes by air. Our Postmaster General permits the use of patriotic slogans on postage meters, and a study is now going forward to see whether the Postal Service can be operated more efficiently by private enterprise. Apparently, our Postmaster General wishes to retire before this administration comes to a close, and that's the report from our Postmaster General, A.G. Heinsohn. Now, the Congress, I'm now going to talk about the Chief Justice. The Congress during the past 2 years has been so busy repealing old laws and cutting down the size of the bureaucracy, and so many of the functions of government and the former bloated bureaucracy have been restored to the states, that our Chief Justice of the Supreme Court now advises that the membership of the court has time to study constitutional law under his direction. Of course, no one is better suited for this job than our great conservative Chief Justice, Dean Clarence Mannion. Now, our Collector of Internal Revenue. Again, much to the surprise of the liberal economists, we find that the revenues of the government are greater than were predicted, even though the personal income tax was reduced to 10% across the board in the first year and abolished at the beginning of the second year. Other sources of taxes have provided unexpected windfalls because the economy is booming everywhere, and the Collector of Internal Revenue is reporting that the retirement of the national debt is being speeded up, all of which contributes to our prosperity and the stability and growth of our economy. Now that the individual is no longer harassed by the Internal Revenue Service, there's a new spirit of freedom throughout the nation. And this spirit of freedom is due largely to the philosophy of our collector of internal revenue, the former governor of Utah, J. Bracken Lee. I bet some of the liberals, if they heard this speech, they would get scared that we should presume that we might win. Just think about that. Our Secretary of Agriculture, we have a report from him which indicates that all functions of the Agriculture Department have been turned over to the states and to the agricultural colleges. A few agricultural technicians have been assigned to the Customs Department in order to prevent the importation of undesirable plants and insects. The major concern of our Secretary of Agriculture is what to do with all the empty buildings owned by the federal government, which had been previously occupied by the army of bureaucrats in the Agriculture Department, which at one time threatened to outnumber the farmers. We're all proud of the work being done by the man who restored freedom to the American farmer, Mr. Tom Anderson. Now, the Attorney General is not a brother or any relative of any of the other members. We made a rule, no brothers. The presidential proclamation concurred in by the Congress, labeling the members of the international communist conspiracy as agents of a foreign power, gave our Attorney General the necessary authority to round up all the members of the American Communist Party. All of the civil rights of the communists were scrupulously observed, but the paramount right of the United States of America to survive as a free republic was also taken into consideration. And we're all proud of the work being done by that great conservative Attorney General, the former judge and expert on communist subversion, Robert Morris. Now, just incidentally, it was the day after the nationwide roundup of members of the Communist Party that the President, with the advice and consent of the Senate, broke off relations with the Soviet Union and all other Iron Curtain countries. And you know what? Pretty within a very few weeks, all the agitational organizations that were carrying out the Communist Party line no longer had any money to paint signs, or they had no direction of where to picket. Now, as soon as all of the personnel assigned to communist countries' embassies and consulates were deported from the country, many members of the Communist Party in this country made complete and open confessions, implicating several of the high-ranking officials of the former administration. Now, the Secretary of the Treasury, and this is a very important office, at first, the majority of the liberal economists in the country claimed that the economy of the United States would be destroyed if we returned to the gold standard. But of course, in returning to the gold standard, we depended largely on the advice available from the Economist National Committee on Monetary Policy. This group of outstanding free enterprise economists were appointed to act as our council of economic advisors, but the decisions were made in the Congress. Of course, a great deal of coordination between the various departments and branches of government was necessary in order to achieve a constructive fiscal policy which set our economy free in order that the greatest good for the greatest number could be achieved by the interplay of economic forces responding to a free market demand for goods and services. Government interference in the field of foreign trade was reduced to the very minimum. The government's activity in foreign trade has been simplified and reduced so that our basic function now is to guarantee the performance of private contracts between and among firms engaged in foreign aid. The government no longer orders, allocates, or controls our foreign trade picture in any commodity. This attitude has strengthened free enterprise system throughout the world because other governments have been forced to follow our lead in these matters. The restoration of foreign trade into private hands had to be coordinated with the restoration of free enterprise inside the United States, as we have seen from the reports of other members of the President's cabinet, whose job it was to restore freedom of enterprise on the domestic scene. The primary move, which was met by enthusiastic response, was the ending of the foreign aid program. We stopped subsidizing socialist and communist governments around the world and thus ended the fearful waste of the American taxpayers' dollars. This paved the way for the resumption of foreign trade by private operators. When we stopped giving away merchandise, goods, and services, that portion of the budget deficit caused by the foreign aid giveaway program disappeared immediately. A study of the foreign aid program from 45 through 60 had showed us that we had given away more than $110 billion, for which we had received nothing but scorn. we found we'd also gone into debt by about $100 billion during the same period. When our conservative candidate for president made these facts clear on his nationwide television campaign programs, the American people were brought to the realization that we had, in fact, borrowed from the international bankers of Wall Street $100 billion, which we had given away to the support of communist and socialist nations around the world. And we were paying interest on the money we'd thrown away. This was one of the major factors contributing to our $10 billion a year interest bill. Of course, the monetary systems of the rest of the world were also stabilized as a result of our own sensible fiscal policies. We can report to you that the people of the United States now have respect for their own government, and the government is responsive to the wishes of the people, because now any citizen can go to the bank and demand for his paper money payment in gold. And ladies and gentlemen, those are the highlights of the first 24 months as reported by esteemed Secretary of the Treasury, the Honorable Walter Spar. And now we come to a very difficult job as the Director of the Budget. You know, ladies and gentlemen, as I give you this report from the various members of this conservative team, I can't help but think of the first few weeks following the election of our conservative president, when the conservative leaders of the country were being considered for the various posts available. One of these leaders, who was quite perplexed, was a man who thought he had outlined for himself a lifetime job, and he suddenly found himself with the prospect of being completely unemployed. This was a retired engineer who for many years had gone around the country preaching economy and government. He had, by his own efforts, convinced hundreds of potential candidates for the Congress that the only way to get elected was for these candidates to adopt one platform, and that was repeal the personal income tax. When the conservatives captured control of the Congress, and all of them who won had included repeal the personal income tax in their platforms, it was realized that the passage of the Liberty Amendment was imminent. This situation reminded us of the story about the little 8-year-old boy who had been overhearing his older brother. Seems that he had taken, the little 8-year-old boy took a girl in the neighborhood for a ride in his little red wagon. They got about 2 blocks away. He said, "Will you or won't you?" And she says, "I will." He says, "My gosh, now what do I do?" So it was decided to put the responsibility of carrying out the intention of the Liberty Amendment into the hands of the man who had been most instrumental in selling the American public on the feasibility of his plan to get the government out of competition with private enterprise, thus making possible the repeal of the personal income tax. The history of these past 24 months and the economies effected in the federal government are largely due to the efforts and the ability of our Director of the Budget, the man with the axe, Willis E. Stone. The report from the Department of Defense reflects the nation's determination to use the armed might of the United States not only as a deterrent of any possible aggression, but also to use America's armed might to extend the frontiers of freedom. The frills have been cut out. No longer does the defense budget carry hidden items which in previous years had been carried under the title of international welfareism. One of the principal activities of the Department of Defense has been and is the training of freedom fighters and liberation forces assigned to us by the various governments in exile. You all remember how thrilled we were with the liberation of Cuba, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Yugoslavia, as the frontiers of tyranny were pushed back one country at a time, and the fighting was carried out by the freedom fighters composed of refugees from the respective countries involved. We're all proud of our Secretary of the Army, Lawrence Bunker. Our Secretary of Navy, Arleigh Burke, and our Secretary for Air, Barry Goldwater. The successful operations which carried out our campaign pledge of liberation without war have been under the able and inspired leadership of General of the Armies, Edwin A. Walker. And that's the report of our civilian Secretary of Defense, the former Senator from South Carolina, the Honorable Strom Thurmond. And now, the final report, but it's the most important division of all. Under the inspired direction of our Secretary of State, the foreign policy of the United States has been accurately, if lengthily, portrayed to the rest of the world. Our policy of liberation without war has been carried out with the maximum dispatch and the minimum amount of friction. During the campaign of 1964, this man was able, through the medium of 12 two-hour television broadcasts, to demonstrate to the people of the United States that there were indeed communists in high places in our State Department. He proved beyond a shadow of a reasonable doubt that the international communist conspiracy, working through the medium of comsimps, had indeed achieved a beachhead within the government of the United States, and in some areas completely dominated the key points of power and direction within various divisions of the executive department. Through his repeated exhortations and personal appearance at mass rallies throughout the nation, he had convinced the thinking people that something indeed was rotten in Washington. We can report that the State Department today is completely manned by Americanists and libertarians who believe in liberty for the individual and independence and sovereignty of all the nations of the world. No one here can underestimate the invaluable contribution which this man has made to the rebirth of freedom inside the United States and the achievement throughout the globe of a better world. And ladies and gentlemen, that's the report of what has been achieved by our Secretary of State, Mr. Robert Welch. In conclusion, as the spokesman for our conservative president, as his press secretary, we are pleased to report that the State of the Union is better than it has ever been, because the American people have been set free from burdening and crushing taxation, free from an overpowering bureaucracy, free from a socialistic government meddling in the private affairs of the citizens. Under the Conservative Party, the state of the nation, 1966, is good.
Well, I'm sure we certainly enjoyed that very much. Nothing like looking ahead to such beautiful prospects. Now, I want to announce one thing, that the moving pictures will be shown by the Committee of a Million in their room on the mezzanine floor, and they'll be continually shown during the rest of the afternoon and evening. I'll turn this mic. Very glad to have been here with you.
I hope you people don't mind our omitting question periods, but it's the only way we can catch up with our schedule in any way. And these people are all more or less available in the Georgian room or in the corridors of the mezzanine for conversation if you want to pursue particular points with them. I have two announcements to make. One concerns the American Opinion Library mobile unit, which is on display at the Park Street entrance to the hotel, probably surrounded by picket. And all the material in that display in the mobile unit may be obtained at the American Opinion booth in the Georgian room. They are not selling things on the street from the library mobile unit down there, but you can acquire any of them if you have enough cash in the Georgian room. The other announcement I've been asked to make is that in case any persons in the audience disbelieve that a sizable number of responsible, prominent Americans are convinced that our nation on its present course is headed for disaster, they might peruse the Catholic Freedom Foundation statement, which is also in the booth, one of the booths in the Georgian room, which has been endorsed by 1,000 of such responsible, prominent American patriots. So much for those announcements. The next speaker on our program is going to be a very factual individual. We've just heard a very imaginative individual. Now we are turning to good, hard facts. There is probably no one in this country who has done more intensive, extensive, and successful research on the Communist Front affiliation of various prominent members of the community than has this speaker. He has published more on the subject than anyone else, and his record is tremendous, and I can commend him to you as being a man very concerned with accuracy and facts with no imagination supplied. So it was great pleasure that I present to you Mr. Myers Lohman of the Circuit Riders, who has come from Ohio to speak to us today.
Mr. Chairman, fellow Americans, if you have in your hand or in your pocket one of the programs, will you please change my address from Cleveland, Ohio to Cincinnati, Ohio? You'll help reduce the deficit in the post office department because I do not live in Cleveland. As I sat in this room last night and listened to Mrs. McKinney go through in detail the arrangements and the work preceding this meeting, I could not help but think that a tape recording of her recital of what had happened to make this meeting possible would be the biggest morale boost that could be injected into the various movements throughout the country if this tape recording should be made and made available to the patriotic societies. I urge upon you that you speak to Mrs. McKinney and her chairman and intercede with her chairman to be sure that she does make this recording. That would be probably the most important speech that came out of this meeting, because the American Martha and Joseph and John across the country needs some know-how on how to do this psychological warfare battle. I want to make it unmistakably clear that there should be no assumption that any person to whom I'm going to make reference is a communist or a pro-communist unless I said so. Stick to the strict text of what I say in our publications when quoting us. It matters little whether a person lends his name and the dignity and respectability of his position or office to a communist cause on a witting or an unwitting or a half-witted basis. Insofar as the security of our nation is concerned, X number of thousands of persons aiding pro-communist or pro-communist causes damage this country, and whether it is done wittingly or unwittingly is of little importance to the security of our nation. It is something like the person who goes to a fire in response to a general alarm or seeing the equipment go to a fire, and in his excitement he picks up a bottle or a bucket or a container of a clear liquid and throws it on the fire, and the immediate response is whoosh. It doesn't make any difference whether the man throwing the clear liquid knew it was water or gasoline. If it was gasoline, the firemen have just as much trouble had the man known it was gasoline. Because of the late schedule, that we are running behind time, I am not going to repeat any of the names, Boston and New England names, that were given in the May Day anti-communist rally when I spoke here in 1960. But I am going to identify the names of many Boston and New England educators and clergymen and other professional persons with having given witting or unwitting aid to the Communist Party through the appearance of their name in support of communist causes in public print. It would be important, I think, for those of you who are actively engaged in anti-socialism, anti-collectivism, and anti-communism to make notes of 5 words that I'm going to give now. These 5 words are the 5 principal features of psychological warfare as taught in a 3-year course in the Lenin School of Political Warfare to many thousands of American and other communist functionaries around the world. After taking the communist training in their own locality, their national party training, and then going to Moscow for 3 years. These persons learned how to do 5 things, and it took them 3 years to learn how to do them successfully. And the learning of how to do these things, 5 things successfully, has made the communist conspiracy to conquer the world the greatest success story in the history of man, second only to the Jesus story and the life and works of Jesus. And then for this reason I say, it is important that whether you are in a sewing circle or a PT&A, or whether you are in a labor union, a church organization, a political organization, or whatever it might be, or whether you want to change the destiny of a nation, you learn how to do these 5 things, and you will succeed. The first principal feature of the communist psychological warfare is frontal assault. Frontal assault. The second feature is to infiltrate. Infiltrate. We'll come back and touch these lightly because we haven't time to go over them thoroughly. The third is to divide. Divide. The fourth is to organize this division that you have created. And the fifth is to decide. Decide whether to operate or disintegrate this apparatus. In 1929, the tactics of the Reverend Dr. Harry F. Ward, then of the Boston Seminary, the tactics of infiltrating American religion and education, as outlined by Harry Ward in his conferences with Stalin and others over a period of months in Moscow and elsewhere, became curriculum in the Lenin School of Political Warfare. Boston has been not only the cradle of America, but because of it being a port and an intellectual center, and because of the communist great affinity for emotion and history, because this was the cradle of America, it was also picked out early as an area which must be colonized on the takeover by the communist apparatus. Now, coming back to our 5, the 5 things. Frontal assault to America came this way. The communists, starting in the 1919 and 20 and for the next couple of years, made their frontal assault to the American worker, the peasant as they called him, by saying, we are communists, we are socialists, we are atheists, you join with us, help us, and we will tear up the existing order here. You will become the owners of everything, and you will be the government. By the mid-1920s, the American communists, most of them, saw that this was not what they wanted. They saw this was merely a fraud, and then the communists decided they had to infiltrate. And it took some 2.5 years of deep concentration on the techniques of infiltrating American church and education. And the communists in the mid-1920s said, if we are going to take America, we must remove the superstitions of religion. As long as X number of millions of Americans believe in God and the United States and would die for either or both, we will never have the means of going over there and taking that country physically. We must infiltrate and take this from within. Now, the reason it has been so difficult for the communists to take us from within is this, in the main. Until recent years, the biggest emphasis in the American home, the American church, and American school and government, the deepest emphasis was on spiritual, moral, and patriotic determination. And those 3 emphases, along with divine guidance and a lot of hard work, made this the greatest freedom of choice opportunity ever available to a large group of persons in the history of the world. There has never been anything to match the American freedom of choice system. You can be a Christian tomorrow or an atheist and back to a Christian. You can be wealthy or a bum. You can be anything in America you want as often as you want, hard enough and work hard enough to become that. The big difficulty in America today is that the American home, the American school, and the American church, to a large extent, have lost their way on the spiritual, moral, and patriotic determination emphasis, as did Rome and Greece and other advanced countries who lost their way and fell. And the history of the first 60 years of this century gives plenty index as to where we might be heading. It would appear that unless we reverse some of these trends, we are headed towards the garbage can of history as a people and as a nation. Now, for specifics, you knew there was a danger to your republic, to your home, your church, or your school, or you wouldn't have come here today. So let's talk about who did what, where, when, and how, and where you might read about it in support of a wide range of causes. We will take 5 of them and then tell you where you can read who did what. In the main, we're talking here in this part of the program about the militant pacifist organizations and projects whose objectives aid and abet wittingly or unwittingly the Soviet apparatus. One world groups which are dedicated to the drastic abridgment or destruction of the sovereignty of the United States and its ability to defend itself against the communist threat. And the third type or category are the socialist organizations and group projects which openly agitate in defense of communist and communist causes. I'm not talking about simple socialism there. I'm talking about the socialists who will die or who will fight for their pacifism and their socialism. And then we're talking about the Popular Front type of action and organization in which communists, socialists, one-worlders, and pacifists openly work as a leftist coalition against the interests and security of the United States. And fifth, the Communist Front organizations, publications, petitions, and other projects which have been adjudged subversive by the agencies of the government. Those are, in the main, the 5 categories of organizations to which we will make reference in the publications. I should like to stop for just a minute to pay deep respect and public admiration, make public admiration in the direction of J. Edgar Hoover, the most trusted American and this is one of the great points this illustrates this respect and reputation and love that the American people have for J. Edgar Hoover is probably one of the greatest illustrations as to why a republic like ours is such a wonderful freedom of choice of system under which to live. This man heads our internal security police system. In the socialist countries, the collectivist countries, the man who heads the internal security police system is the most feared, despised, and hated man in the country. Let's hope we can preserve the integrity and the autonomy of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now we shall talk for a minute about the supreme bid for power. How many minutes have I, sir? The supreme bid for power through a front in the first 25 years of the Communist Party's history of the United States was the National Citizens Political Action Committee, announced by a Special Committee on Un-American Activities in Washington in 1944 as the supreme bid for power. 83% of the members had records of affiliation with communist or communist front organizations, and I will say without reservation that many of them were identified communists. Who were these 144 persons? Which among them came from the Boston area? We had an Albert Sprague Coolidge, professor at Harvard University. I believe that's in Massachusetts. We had one Zara DuPont from Cambridge. Thomas H. Eliot, an attorney at Cambridge. John Kenneth Galbraith. William Nelson, Falls Village, Connecticut, and Liston Pope of the Yale Divinity School, and Alan Sweezy, professor of economics, Williams College, Massachusetts. I will caution the gentlemen and ladies of the press to quote me accurately. There is an ample tape recording process of every word and syllable, and I will be very grateful if I am quoted correctly and not out of context. I should like to make a quick reference to some of the demonstrating organizations at our doors today. I am as grateful to them as I am to Mrs. McKinney, this chairman, and all of those who work so hard. You got the local publicity for the God and Freedom meeting. These stupid punks got us wire service publicity. Thank you very much for being so stupid. The conservative movement in the United States cannot get wire service. It is only with the assistance and the stupidity of some of these groups who speak in the name of such groups as NAACP, CORE, and a number of others. Now, I want to speak, since I read the NAACP signs, I want to make myself clear on that. I do not represent that it is a communist organization. But I would like to give you a little background if you are one of the picketers or within range of my voice or by one of the tape recordings of what I'm saying. I would like to fill you in on the history of your organization and that part that might have been performed before you were old enough to say NAACP. You were saying Dada in those days. In 1928, there was a Sixth World Congress of the Communist Party International in Moscow. And in the same year, the Communist Garland Fund, the American Service Fund, a Harvard man's and students' inheritance, gave $100,000 in one check to the NAACP, 1928, the same year. The communists owned and operated the fund. Ben Gitlow, who was later the secretary of the Communist Party, or around at that time was one of the directors or trustees. And I learned much about this from Ben Gitlow. Ever since that $100,000 and the year 1928, when it was given to the NAACP, there has been a fight inside of the NAACP for control. The commies have been trying to take it over, but they have never taken it over. They have had great influence. They've had greater influence in some areas and districts, but it is not a communist organization. But I would observe that it would be difficult to find a mass membership organization in the United States that has been much more seriously infiltrated than the NAACP. 146 of its 235 officers, national committee members, and board members, as of 1957, had pro-communist and communist front records which have been published in a hearing in Florida in 1958. I would like to know, and if some of you can learn, will you mail to me 110 Government Place, Cincinnati 2, Ohio, the name of one anti-communist leader in the NAACP movement, or in the Students' Nonviolent Movement, or any liberal movement. Where is the anti-communist movement in the liberal movement? There isn't any identified anti-communist, organized anti-communist movement in the whole left of center. If you learn of one, I would like to know so I could make a retraction. Now for Boston names. I am not inferring that any one of these persons is a socialist, a communist, wittingly or unwittingly or half-wittingly loaned his name to this position. I am saying only that here is a petition of one of the groups undertaking to get Carl Braden and Frank Wilkinson, two persons identified in public hearings as communists, who were then in the penitentiary. There was an attempt to get these men out of the federal penitentiary. The petition is addressed to President Kennedy. There is a copy here for the press, and if the press, any of the members of the press want to